amazing. I had a couple of students who applied, and one who had a partial affiliation. So,
Right.
yeah,
we just had Ocean Vuong last night.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah, it was scintillating. It was quite the experience.
What I've heard of read on media. Not even.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started with our next session. Thank you.
I mean, there was not a dry because of the way.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Just repeating Gwendolyn. So welcome to our panel, Remembering Lynda S. Hart. My name is Nat Rivkin. I'm a graduate student in the English department, and it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dagmawi Woubshet. Dag Woubshet is the Edmund J. and Louise K. Kahn Endowed Associate Term Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS, and the co-edited volume, Ethiopia, Literature, Art, and Culture. His essays have appeared in Callaloo, Transition, NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and The Atlantic. Woubshet is the recipient of fellowships from Civitella Ranieri, the Africa Institute in Sharjah, and the Modern Art Museum in Addis Ababa, where he curated Julie Murray-Tu, the Addis Show. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right. Thank you, Nat. Good afternoon. A little louder. Good afternoon. There we go. There we need some energy. All right. What a pleasure to moderate this panel, remembering such a pioneer in the field, Lynda Hart. I'm going to introduce our three distinguished panelists, and then we'll take it from there. All right. Okay. First up, we have Carlos Decena, who is an interdisciplinary scholar whose interests include critical theory and social and cultural analysis, with a particular emphasis on transnationalism and diaspora in the American continent, US, Latino America, and the Caribbean. His first book, Tacit Subjects, Belonging and Same-Sex Desire Among Dominican Immigrant Men, was published by Duke University Press in 2011. His following book, Circuits of the Sacred, Fagotology in the Black Latinx Caribbean. I love that title, and had the pleasure of hearing him read from the book when it came out at the Kelly Writers House. That book articulates Latinx, queer, and Afro-diasporic spiritologies in the service of non-denominational sex and body, affirmative notion of the divine for queers of color. It was published in 2023 by Duke University Press. The author of several single and co-authored articles published in peer-reviewed publications in the US and in the Americas. Professor Decena is now Professor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. He is also Director of the Office of Undergraduate Intellectual Life at the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. Welcome, Professor Decena. Welcome, Carlos. Next up, we have Professor Jim Downs, who is the Gilder Lehrman-National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Civil War Era Studies and History at Gettysburg College. He is the author of Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, published by Harvard University Press in 2021, which is being translated into Chinese, French, Japanese, Korean, and Russian. Impressive. His other books include Sick from Freedom, African American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, and Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation, Basic Books 2016. He co-edited, along with Jennifer Breyer and Jennifer L. Morgan, a monograph titled Connections, Histories of Race and Sex in North America. He's published essays in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Washington Post, The New York Times, Vice, Slate, LA Times, among other publications. He's also the editor of Civil War History. In 2023, last year, he was elected to both the Society for American Historians in the US and the Royal Historical Society in the UK. Please help me welcome Professor Downs. Last but not least, Professor Chen Manion is a social and cultural historian whose work examines the role of gender and sexuality in American life. Professor Manion's is the Winkley. Is that Winkley or Winkley? Oh, okay. All right. I asked. Just, well, we'll go with the W then. Winkley Professor of History and Political Economy at Amherst College and author of Liberty's Prisoners, Carceral Culture in Early America, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, a book which received the Mary Kelly Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. They're also the author of Female Husbands, A Trans History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, which was a finalist for the OAH Lawrence Levine Award for the Best Book in the U.S., Cultural History, and also recipient of the British Association of Victorian Studies Best Book Prize. Please help me extend a warm welcome to Professor Manion.
Turn it to you all. And we can do a 3-minute warning?
Sure. Okay.
All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a little bit of a reunion because Jen, Jim, and I have the dubious distinction of having taken a course taught by Lynda Hart called Sexuality on Stage. A wild ride of a course, probably the wildest ride I had at Penn, including the police coming when I was presenting my research. Girl, we were lit. We were lit. We were messing around in that class. I have to say, I was afraid of Lynda Hart. When people live in their truth with the level of conviction of someone like Lynda Hart, they can scare you. At the time, I was, it must have been my junior year, and I was a transfer student to Penn from LaSalle University, a school up the street. A recent immigrant, I had arrived in the U.S. at age 15, going through the public school system, and through the work of people like Alan Filreis, who mentored me even before I arrived at Penn. I made my way through Penn. I was the English department was a wonderful place for me because I found mentors. I found gay parents. Stuart Current was and his partner many years, Joseph Whitrick, took me under their belt. And there was Al all over the place. But I have to say something. There was nobody with the level of conviction and simple badassery that one Lynda Hart had. Lynda Hart had the capacity, and I remember this course, and please, because you were all there too, we were in the same course after all. She had, I think it was at the beginning, single-handedly called out one of the foundational fictions of a certain kind of racist white liberal position to a majority white student body, and she just simply blurted out in a class a comment to the effect of reverse racism does not exist because Black people are simply not in a position to affect such a thing. And I don't know if you recall, but I do recall the level of racial meltdown that went on in that class. At the time, I have to say, being a new immigrant, dealing with imposter syndrome, being white presenting, yet understanding that I just wasn't white, I was a little busy with all things sexuality, which sort of defined the horizon for me to be rebellious. So I would show up in classes wearing wigs. I outed a few people. I slept with a few of my classmates. I was busy at Penn. It was a very, very busy time. And I really cathected a lot of my neuroses through sexuality when in fact a lot of my problems were fundamentally racial ones, having to do with how much of an inoculation I had experienced as a relatively upwardly mobile immigrant, at a time when most Black people, most Black presenting people at Rutgers were dealing with the likes of the water buffalo incident, which you guys may remember, right? I remember very distinctly simply not understanding what in the heck had happened when this Jewish kid yelled at these Black sorority girls. And then I remember weeks and weeks of sitting in front of these students who were actually people I was close to because there were programs that brought us together, the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program, and witnessed them cry over things that I just didn't understand. Being Dominican, I have Black presenting brothers, blood brothers, father and mother, whose experience of racism was very stark, unlike my own. And so this moment with Lynda and many more in that class stayed with me, for her ability to simply not suffer fools of a certain white liberal racist position. And I don't know, perhaps Jim or Jen can expand a little more on the implications of this, because Lynda, I didn't become her student. I took that course with her. And it blew me away. The things we did in that course blew me away, the things that other people did in that course. But in thinking about honoring her, I think it behooves me, at least as a Penn alum, as a kind of cranky full professor at this point, of a public university with a 50-year old history of departments of women's gender and sexuality studies, Latino studies, Africana studies, to call attention to a rather obvious thing about the state of affairs that we have at this university. How can it be that a university such as this, that prides itself of having people, legends like Lynda Hart, and some living legends who are out there in these fields, in women's studies, sexuality studies, in all of our fields, actually people who get hired and brought into this university to give lots of glitter to its claim of being whatever Penn claims to be, right? How could it be that this university doesn't have a department? How can it be that women's gender sexuality studies at this place is not a department, that has its own tenure lines, that supports the growth of interdisciplinary scholarship? Well, I mean, probably it's probably best to leave that to the publics, right? Or to the smaller privates. So then Penn, like Columbia, like Yale, like to some degree NYU, but let's talk about the Ivies for a second, can perform the job it usually does of extracting the stars once they are groomed by someone else. That's what happens. I come from a public, I have some skin in the game. If Penn called me, which it probably won't, because I have a PhD in women's studies that's not legible. I have a PhD in American studies. That I just kind of crossed the fields. It's not legible in a certain way. to some of these institutions until, you know, perhaps a MacArthur, a Guggenheim, whatever. And some of that stuff, suddenly people start forgetting that your formation is interdisciplinary because you bring fabulosity. And that fabulosity quotient has much to offer to a university that treads in symbolic capital, throws money at problems, and basically tries to do things on the cheap, like run this fabulous conference, right? Without making a substantive commitment to the colleagues who are here. And I'm not just complaining about my transportation fees. I need to say at the outset that I understood very well the infrastructural challenges that this university presents to the good people who have labored for many, many years to do this kind of work. When I was an undergrad here, I did not know women's studies. I wouldn't have, well, there are a lot of things I didn't know. I probably wouldn't have understood racism if it hit me with a, you know, with a baseball bat, because racism was something that was happening to other people. And I was so busy being an immigrant and so busy being, and so busy passing, right? That you wouldn't have caught me dead taking courses with the Black faculty, even the Black faculty in English. I'm actually doing a little bit of retrospective, you know, analysis here, because at the time I just thought, well, you know, I just take Byron, Shelley, and, you know, all them people, and most of my professors were white men. And the Chicanos and Chicanas who came through didn't stay. And, you know, I sat somewhat befuddled when one of my older mentors said that the one Chicana that the English department had was not renewed because she was not up to snuff. That person would go on to leave the academy, right? The other person who was here for a flash second became the president of the Latino Studies Association many, many years later. But, you know, they knew the drill. They knew what was up here and what was possible and what was impossible. My question to all of us now becomes, in the spirit of speaking the truth and speaking from the truth, right? In the spirit of someone like Lynda, is where do we go now? We celebrate, but we have a lot to do. So much to do at this university that I believe some of these conversations be better had directly with the president, directly with the provost, whoever those officers are, to basically show them how this works out. There is a political economy to all of this. The publics are doing and the smaller privates, you know, hand it to them, right? They do a lot of the labor of supporting, bolstering, protecting some of these fields and scholars. But little queens like me, and of which there are plenty at Penn, right? They're, oh, well, the ones who were here and the ones who are still here and the ones who don't know yet that they are. I wonder to what degree we continue to do a disservice to these young folks, particularly to our trans and non-binary brothers and sisters who are now experiencing increased policing, increased harassment, and increased targeting, right? To what degree the kind of environment that we hold, right, being precarious in the way that programs tend to be, continues to reproduce circumstances in which things happen like what happened to me. I was one of the lucky ones. I actually was mentored. One of my main advisors said that I didn't come out of the closet, I flew out of the closet, because I was pretty badass, but never as badass as Lynda was. And I have to say that if we're to live in the spirit, and, you know, I turned to Jim, when I settled on the title Fagotology, I actually thought of Lynda, because I thought Lynda would be proud that, you know, one of her queer offspring came off with such a thing, right? The way I'm hoping she's looking upon all of us and hoping that we can still pave the way to make sure that when the little ones, the ones who are coming behind, because we have to think of them, right? They will find an institutional foundation that is stronger than the one we've encountered. I think that's the task. She definitely laid that foundation very firmly within me and in all our hearts. If I may claim to speak for other people other than myself, that class and her presence continue to guide me. You know, when you need a moral horizon, Lynda Hart is her memory and the compass of the way she lived her life and made her scholarship continue to guide me.
Okay, so first, Carlos, thank you so much for your elegant and eloquent words. I was actually thinking a lot about Lynda Hart's radical intellectual influence when I was thinking about this panel, and I actually did think of your title and your book, Female Husbands, as really kind of capturing her radical vision of scholarship. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I'm doing the Civil War. So okay, so I prepared my comments as a sort of just so I could make sure I stayed within the confines, and I wanted to of the presentation. So I'm just going to read it if that's okay. Not too far from the French Quarter in New Orleans, a group of men gathered in an apartment to have sex. The men worried that their noisy neighbors might report them to the police, so they decided to pretend they were hosting a bachelor party. They hired a young woman to dress up as a Playboy bunny one month, a French maid the next, a sex worker the following month. The party rotated to certain locations, and so did her costumes. The men cheered when she entered the apartment. They played loud music to disguise the sound of sex. They made their voices loud enough to masquerade their desires. She stood in front of them, sometimes pretending to strip, sometimes egging them on, all the time watching them as they unzipped their pants and got naked. Their voices would eventually dissipate, and the only sound that could be heard came from a record player where she flipped vinyl albums on a turntable. Even though her performance was over, she was paid to remain at the party, to keep up the facade and quell the neighbors' suspicions. Decades later, she would write, "If desire is always in some sense theatrical, is it so in much the same way that play always takes place in the space between the spectator and the performance? Desire, like theater, takes place in the fantasy one constructs with others, and like any communal experience, requires a relinquishing of control." Standing in front of men dressed as a Playboy bunny, a French maid, a sex worker, she was not just getting money to make ends meet as a graduate student at Tulane in the early 1980s. She was writing drafts in her minds of theories that would eventually become books that explain what happens between the body and the flesh. Her name was, as I assumed you have guessed, Lynda Hart. Queer theory was not just an academic intervention that conceptualized the political, the social, and even biological coordinates of sexuality, but it was the language that she used to explain her queer experience that just can't be dismissed as a side hustle. Both the body and the flesh are illusions. Both are phantasmatic, and I want to say phantasmagorical is what I thought she was saying, but it's phantasmatic. Okay, phantasmic. Phantasmic is what she's saying, and I want to say anyway. The body keeps us anchored in the words we have constructed in reality, and the flesh is a place toward which we reach that always exceeds our grasp. That indeed must elude us, for it is the sight beyond or before the body. Trained as a scholar of drama, Lynda Hart wrote her first book on playwright Sam Shepard's metaphorical plays. By the early 1990s, swept up by the excitement of Split Britches, a feminist and queer theater group that formed in New York City, she turned her attention to the emerging endeavor of feminist theater. She edited 2 anthologies, Making a Spectacle, feminist essays on contemporary women's theater, and Acting Out. On the second, with her former partner Peggy Phelan, which the book featured the stars of Split Britches on the cover. Can you just put the slide up? Thanks. Slide. Okay, sorry. Based in downtown New York City, Split Britches produced a satirical play, Lesbians Who Kill. That's it, thank you. Lesbians Who Kill, which was inspired by Aileen Wuornos' story, a lesbian sex worker in Florida who robbed and killed 7 of her clients in 1989-90. Wuornos initially claimed self-defense for these murders and was placed on death row and eventually executed. Wuornos' epic story troubled Lynda Hart. In fact, she dedicated her later monograph, Fatal Women, to Wuornos and, as I quote, for all of the women who've been vilified, pathologized, and murdered for defending themselves by whatever means necessary, end quote. Split Britches Productions nonetheless became Lynda's muse, her research, and her source of political activism. Split Britches had as one of its founding, thank you. Split Britches had as one of its founding members, Deb Margolin, explained to me the brilliance of desperation about it. Margolin further explained, we were defiant, we defied stereotypes, referring to her co-founders, Peggy Shaw and Lois Weaver. We didn't even look like we belonged. This little Southern belle, this butch from South Boston, this weirdo Jew. We just stood there. It was ridiculous. We made no apologies for ourselves. I think this was one of the most radical things about Split Britches at the time. Inspired by Wuornos' story, Lesbians Who Kill is a satire about the media fascinations with lesbians as murderers. In the actual play, the 2 main characters never commit a murder, but are confronted with the moral question of how to address the rage that they experience from the violence committed against them as both feminist and queer people. The play oscillated between a feminist meditation on women as aggressors and a queer production that used lesbian intimacy to explore gender identity. Lynda Hart explains the significance of the play when she writes, quote, if women have been constructed as the nonviolent gender, lesbians have historically been the site where women's aggression has been displaced, contained, and reified. Radical lesbians of the 1970s define themselves as the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosions. Lesbians who kill might be seen as the uncanny form of that rhetoric, Hart writes. Theater became a place to imagine taboo subjects that riled queer communities and explored with them, as Hart explains, with hilarity and rage. Lesbians Who Kill became part of Hart's second monograph, Fatal Women. The arresting image on the cover captures Hart's daring provocations and intellectual boldness. In Fatal Women, Hart theorized about the ways in which lesbian desire had served as a phantom to rationalize the notion of a woman serial killer. Hart argued how a number of 1990s films, from Basic Instinct to Thelma and Louise, all depicted women's aggression as being marked by the spectator of lesbianism. As critic Anne Kubely, who was one of Hart's students at Penn, aptly noted, performance studies, as Lynda helped to define it, is much more than a form of academic and theoretical investigation. Performance became a site for the possibility of experiencing the body, loosened from the bounds of coercion in its most violent, physical, social, and rhetorical forms. Hart adds, I demonstrate some discursive maneuvers in which the production of violent women and representation depends on a disarticulated threat of desire between women. It's not a matter then of looking for the lesbian behind representation of violent women, but rather of understanding how the lesbian functions in a structural dialectic of appearance-disappearance, where the aggressive woman is visible. Hart further contends that the lesbian in turn disappears in the masculine imaginary so that the violent women can ascend her place in the phallocratic symbolic. Theoretical critics will have noted Lynda's debts to Lacan and psychoanalysis. Hart was committed to theory as practice and tried to teach us how to apply theory in our lives. Once in class, she asked the 3 of us, among others, to use our desk to form a circle and made us read sections from Foucault's History of Sexuality. It was a time at Penn in the mid-1990s when many faculty turned to theory as a radical intervention to discuss subjectivity. In Farah Jasmine Griffin's class, Venus Rising, Black Women's Fiction Theory and Criticism, Griffin put us in small groups and assigned us various theories to study. I was in the group on Lacan, which Farah told us, quote, "The entrance into language is the submission of social control." In both Farah and Lynda's courses, I was introduced to the study of theory, which was not just part of an academic mantelpiece, but became the language that helped me to come in terms with my queer identity, unspoken desires, and the constraint of language, which Spivak would later define as epistemic violence, served as a personal rubric to navigate the tumults of coming out. There was something within Lynda's theories, both articulated then and reflecting on it now, that summoned an engagement with the past that has guided my own research. In Between the Body and the Flesh, she wrote about the value of the subjunctive tense, the past that would have been. This has been generative in my own research that explores the intimate relations between enslaved men in the 18th and 19th century United States. Based on a dearth of evidence that documented enslaved men's desires and intimacies, I turned to Lynda's work. She writes, "The tense is the future anterior, the past that will have been. Still, I cannot get it right. I want so much to write in the subjunctive, the past that would have been, the mode of subordination." Hart's theoretical intervention unleashes a reconfiguration of how the past can be constructed. Possibility for Hart lies more in the variation of the verb tense. More than just a play on grammar, Hart's project suggests a way to rethink the past by rethinking the verb. Changing the tense, in turn, reorders the subject of the sentence and the actions in which they could be executed. The outcome, therefore, disavows a strict application of empiricism and archival recounting and instead imagines the possible. While I cannot trace the genealogy, Saidiya Hartman's powerful evocation of critical fabulation articulates a similar political project. In 2001, months after her untimely death, the historical gaze shifted and Lynda Hart risked becoming the victim of historical erasure. I returned to Penn for a conference on sexuality in early America that Kathy Brown, who's here, had organized. Sitting through the sessions of historians arguing about sex in the colonies, I thought about how Lynda would respond to these attempts to excavate the past. I left College Hall and walked over to Bennett Hall, where her office was. When Lynda was in between apartments or girlfriends, her office in Bennett Hall became her home. The space was stacked with books from floor to ceiling. Lynda stapled a piece of red satin over the door of the window of the office and slept on a brown corduroy couch. Photographs of her friends and even her mother were hung on the wall, and candles decorated the once paper-cluttered cabinet tops. As a research assistant, I still had a key to her office. When I was like, am I gonna like publicly announce this and now get arrested for trespassing 20 years later? When I approached her office, I noticed that the red satin drape was still hanging over the door window. As I entered, I was surprised to see that all her books, papers, and photographs were still intact. I sat down on the floor and I said a special prayer to Lynda and then left, not knowing what would happen to her stuff. On the final day of the conference, I returned to Lynda's office, but as I climbed the steps of Bennett Hall and reached the third floor, I could not believe what I saw. Outside of Lynda's office were piles of her belongings thrown on the floor. Her middle school yearbook, unfinished manuscripts, a card from her former partner, Peggy Phelan, checkbooks and banking statements, her sister's first published story with an inscription to her father, book contracts, and her Aunt Ray's self-published cookbook. As I began picking up the items, Jen Manion came running up the stairs and noticed how I was trembling. I didn't know what to do. All of Lynda's stuff was just out in the open for anyone to see and to tamper with. I knew that Lynda would not have wanted her personal belongings just thrown out in the hallway like this. Jen called Ellie DeLappy, who is here, director of the Penn Women's Center, who immediately drove in a station wagon, and we all, this is really important. This is like one of the most important historical interventions of my career, actually. She's all lesbian. And, and we packed all that we could in her car and brought the rest to the Penn Women's Center with the hope of establishing a library in honor of Lynda. While this is the part of the paper where, as a historian, I really want to talk about the archive and what the archive means and blah, blah, blah. And I really was very interested in this, but I want to honor her and I want to honor her words and I want to say her words in this space at this time and is as a sort of radical intervention. While I hope that we could use this forum to formally organize an effort to commemorate her past, I want to devote my remaining time to her words. By the end of her life, queer theory turned to autobiographical preludes that captured early life incidents that inspired and haunted some of her study of sexuality. In her article, Living Under the Sign of the Cross, Some Speculations on Femininity, which appeared in Women in Performance after she died in 2002, she talks about her mother shucking corn and shelling peas. She writes, mesmerized by her sure hands, I fixed on her strong forearms as they whisked the husk off in one swift swoop, and the sweet white corn rose naked from its sheath. She popped the peas out of their husk by rolling her thumbs under them, sending them zigzagging against the metal bowl like boys shooting marbles. Sitting with my legs bent under me, rocking on my hunches, I tried to shook and shell as fast as she could. Mama taught me to keep my knees together, my legs crossed twice, once at the calves, another at the ankles. Knee-high to her thighs, open and swaying to make a breeze, pelvis wide and relaxed. I could see her, smell her. When the wind whipped up a hot blast, I could almost taste her. Mama sat open like a butch on a bar stool. I wanted to drink her down. Hart then shifts to telling a story about her rough and tumble high school boyfriend. She writes, we spent our afternoons after school shopping in hardware stores, intoxicated by their smells, fondling items that we would purchase, imagining how we would improvise with them later that night. No one ever said a word about the bolts in the wall over my white headboard or the collection of ropes and chains sometimes left carelessly dangling from their post. She then tells of her best friend. The night before my best friend got married at age 17, I spent the night with her. It was like many others, except she had a wedding gown hanging on the bedroom door. We danced to some old Beatles records until we both fell down on her bed exhausted. I dressed her in her wedding gown. Then we did what we had done many times before, but this time I was a little rougher with her, more forceful, aggressive, quote, preparing her for her husband. I was the only bridesmaid who couldn't wear my white gloves with my yellow gown the next day. I cried so hard through the ceremony that no one could hear the preacher. Maybe Lynda knew that lesbian sexuality and the mark of aggression would find no place in a traditional archive, so she turned to what she did best. She wrote down her memories and published them in a journal devoted to feminist theory. Only then could they be saved and published after her death. Only then could these moments be remembered for what happens between the body and the flesh.
In Queer and Now, Eve Sedgwick wrote about the negative, insidious way that LGBTQ youth are denied access to LGBTQ adults and knowledge about our shared histories. She wrote, quote, the systematic separation of children from queer adults, their systematic sequestration from the truth about the lives, culture, and sustaining relations of adults they know who may be queer, the complicity of parents, teachers, clergy, even of the mental health professions in invalidating and hounding kids who show gender dissonant tastes, behavior, body language. When I took Sexuality on stage with Lynda in the fall of 1994 at the age of 20, it was the first time in my life that my teacher was openly gay. More than that, Lynda was a working class dyke. Her irreverence for Penn's culture of elitism and wealth was matched only by her devotion to thinking and learning, to using all the tools of literary criticism, performance studies, and feminist and queer theory to take up the most pressing questions about sexuality, desire, violence, and power. Lynda was Southern, sassy, witty, and kind. The class was made up of some confirmed homosexuals, the curious and the questioning, the feminists, and the hip English majors in search of the cutting edge. All were brimming with energy and anticipation and anxiety. Upon later reflection of my work in the course, I was horrified to see that I argued butch femme relationships represented a simple, quote, mimicry of heterosexual norms. In my assessment of the show Anniversary Waltz by Split Britches, I wrote, quote, from the traditional roles of man and woman in the ceremony to the representation of a typical hetero middle-aged couple who raised a child together in a small apartment for over 10 years. This play is crying out assimilation to the hetero masses. We are just like you, accept us and don't fear us. To which Lynda replied in a red pen, she actually used red pen. So Jen, I guess you disagree with me. Do you really think, as Jay Dolan argued, that Anniversary Waltz is assimilationist? I guess you do, but for the life of me, I don't see it. It's such an aggressive parody, in my view. Oh, well, A-. What did I know? I was 20 years old, 6 months out of the closet, and I'm sure I didn't do the reading. Of course, I also hadn't met a brave femme yet, which changes everything. Jessica actually wrote that. And also reminded me this morning that it is braver for the femme to be queer than it is for me because I don't have a choice. Lynda always wrote of sexuality as something that was raced and classed. In Fatal Women, she draws extensively on Havelock Ellis's claim about the prevalence of female homosexuality in prisons and lunatic asylums. Hart writes, quote, if the historical entry of the lesbian into discourse was her identification as the invert of sexology, it was a historical construct that not only pathologized and criminalized her, but that also displaced the threat of women's sexual deviance onto women of color and working class women. It would seem to be precisely when the threat of lesbianism became an area of concern for white middle-class European men that lesbian was construed as a secret that must be withheld from its potential practitioners, end quote. The issue of race and class in early sexology is something that so many scholars omit. And I'm reminded once again in looking back at the way that Lynda was working at the intersection of queer theory and Black feminism in a way that was unique. Fatal Women inspired me to write a book about women who were vilified, dismissed, criminalized, and marginalized in their lives, as well as the way that race, class, and sexuality shaped their alleged criminality. This became my first book, Liberty's Prisoners, which is a social history of the origins of punishment. As an early American historian, however, I received lots of pushback against my arguments regarding heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality in early American prisons. I eventually pared down those claims and let go of much of it, sadly. If you call bringing it up 15 years later, letting it go, well, whatever. Kathy always supported me and defended me on it. In Lynda's class, the theory was never separated from the art, was never separated from our lives, was never separated from politics. I think that synergy was the most powerful lesson I took from her that has most deeply influenced my own teaching, scholarship, research, and advocacy. Just doing a huge transition to the present. We are living in unprecedented times of transgender visibility, recognition, and vulnerability. A 2022 Pew Research Center survey found that 5.1% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 29 identify as transgender or non-binary. Higher education has been slow to respond to the existence, experiences, and needs of this population. Trans and non-binary people are scarcely represented among senior administrators or tenured faculty. While pathbreaking scholarship in trans studies is being published at a record pace, few undergraduates in American colleges and universities actually have access to it. It is so easy to put a rainbow sticker on your door or ask your students their pronouns on the first day, which I don't necessarily recommend. College and university faculty, staff, and administrators, however, simply must do more. We must undertake the substantial task of integrating trans studies, research, theories, and methods throughout the curriculum. As a historian, I've dedicated much of my research to understanding how gender and sexuality shape various systems in American history, from the formation of the carceral state to transformations in how legal and medical authorities perceive gender nonconformity in those assigned female at birth. My book, Female Husbands, A Trans History, is a model of rigorous trans historicism that offers readers the tools to interrogate how modern notions of transgender identity and expression came into being, helping them to think critically about the past with the trans conceptual lens while avoiding anachronism. I felt so committed to crafting a book that was historically accurate while also uncovering a trans past and speaking to the concerns of actual trans people today. Much of my work and teaching is infused with this tension between scholarly methods that reject identity claims and contemporary politics that require them, between past and present, between abstract interpretive arguments and a desire to figure out what actually happened. This often comes down to a simple question. Were female husbands really transgender? Or were female husbands really lesbians? What are we to make of the decades of scholarship that minimize gender while privileging sexuality? Have I simply flipped the script? Is the past simply up for grabs, waiting to be molded into the form or category that most pleasingly suits the contemporary reader? I think about these questions all the time, especially when teaching my introductory courses, the history of sexuality and the intro to queer and trans studies. Most of my students are 100% self-assured in determining which figures from the past were really trans and which were not. How can I dislodge their certainty and get them to consider the historical and social context of the subject? How can I explain the historical emergence of the concept of gender identity in a way that makes sense to them? The same goes for homosexuality, which is even harder to historicize at this point. I don't know if you guys agree, but it seems like each generation seemed to be more and more convinced that they were born this way. One of the reasons I defected from the English department, I was an English major, but I became a history major. I finished with an English minor.
I remember.
Is because I wanted to learn what really happened rather than debate one author's worldview. I like a variety of tangible records representing multiple viewpoints, and I love old newspapers. If, quote, journalism is the first draft of history, then it seemed like a great starting point. But now I'm not so sure. And now I'm going to totally switch gears again, but it's to kind of unpack my uncertainty about the value of history in this moment, actually, and the reliability of the archive. After reading the past 10 days of coverage about the death, murder of Choctaw non-binary teenager Nex Benedict, my heart aches. I feel sick to my stomach. They were just a kid. The media coverage is chillingly inhumane, intimating that Nex asked for it, platforming the vehemently transphobic superintendent of schools in Oklahoma, hedging on whether gender actually had anything to do with the bullying and beating when sources point to it being actually the only thing. This first draft of history is biased propaganda, serving us up again as fodder for the Republican agenda. I first learned of Nex Benedict from the Instagram feed of them, the news social media site. The headline, non-binary teen Nex Benedict dies after being attacked by peers in a school bathroom on February 20th. On February 21st, the New York Times reported, anti-trans policies draw scrutiny after 16-year-old's death in Oklahoma. The student, who did not identify as male or female according to their family, died a day after an altercation in a school bathroom. The police said the death was not the result of the trauma. On February 23rd, the New York Times published a profile of the Oklahoma school superintendent, Ryan Walters, who claims, quote, radical leftists had created a narrative about the death of the 16-year-old Nex Benedict that, quote, hasn't been true. The piece was titled, quote, after non-binary student's death, school's chief defends restrictive gender policies. So on the one hand, I appreciate the opportunity to learn about the views of people like Walters so that I can challenge them. He said, among other things, quote, there's not multiple genders, there's two. That's how God created us. He said he did not believe that non-binary or transgender people exist. But according to the New York Times, he's a nice guy who loves history. On February 26th, the New York Times reports, quote, several details, including Nex's exact cause of death, remain unknown. They report the police autopsy findings from February 21 that determined Nex, quote, did not die as a result of trauma. And they go on to say, quote, it is unclear whether Nex was beaten because of their gender identity. As a historian who often relies on newspaper records of the past to help me get to the truth of an event, I feel like I'm being gaslighted in real time. The anti-trans bias of so much New York Times coverage of the past few years has been hotly debated and well documented. Perhaps naively, I did not expect it to determine the reporting on the death of a child who was regularly and horrendously bullied at school because of their gender identity and expression. I have a few excerpts of Nex's actual words that we do have record of from various sources. Some of it's from text from their grandmother, some of it's from the video footage, a 20-minute footage of the officer who was it's absolutely outrageous if you've seen it in the hospital, this 20-minute interrogation. It's in Nex's words, quote, I didn't really see the point in it, end quote, on why they didn't report the bullying. Quote, they're making comments, they're throwing stuff, they're calling us names about the kids harassing them. Quote, because of the way we dress, in answer to why students harass them. Quote, I got jumped at school, 3-on-1, had to go to the ER, a text after the fight. Quote, they grabbed onto my hair, I grabbed onto them. I threw one of them into a paper towel dispenser, then they got my legs out from under me and got me on the ground. My friends tried to jump in and help, but I'm not sure. I blacked out, end quote. They said that directly to the police, who told them not to file charges because they instigated this. It was their fault. And that's all caught on the footage. The day of the fight, Nex was taken to the hospital by their grandmother after they got home from school. And then they were sent home from the hospital. They were cleared. The next day they collapsed and died. The conservative movement has spent decades figuring out the right angle to shatter the loosely held alliance between feminists, gays, trans people, and the left. They are starting to see tangible gains in their war against trans people, which may in fact help them take control of the presidency and both houses of Congress in the upcoming election. How did this happen? In the wake of the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015 with the Obergefell decision, the right determined that it needed a new focus for their culture war that would both galvanize the right and divide the left. Quote, we knew we needed to find an issue that the candidates were comfortable talking about, said Terry Schilling, the president of the American Principles Project, a socially conservative advocacy group. Quote, and we threw everything at the wall. After considerable research, some trial and error, you might remember in 2016, they proposed a bathroom ban in North Carolina that failed, right? It backfired. All these big companies, organizations, conferences, everybody pulled out. So they found a winner, trans youth, with an emphasis on sports and medicine. They set the agenda, the lawsuits, and the campaign. They framed the issues deceptively to entice interest and sympathy, not only from hardline conservatives, but also moderates and liberals, and especially parents and feminists. The New York Times has taken their bait, using right-wing framings, made-up problems, and outright lies in their approach to reporting and opining on trans issues. Seldom do any of the insights of our fields, LGBTQ studies, history theory, make the pages. There's no telling the scope and scale of the destruction that their many years-long campaign of willfully ignorant, anecdotal, and unethical coverage of trans issues will cause. They have normalized and liberalized anti-trans bigotry beyond repair, at least for this current legislative and electoral cycle. Sorry, it's getting darker. I got to read from Project 2025 in case people aren't aware of it yet. So the Heritage Foundation released Project 2025, the Presidential Transition Project. In their preface, they identified the top problems plaguing America today as inflation, drug overdose deaths, and quote, children suffering the toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and pornography invading their libraries. There is so much to horrify in the report, but I'd like to focus on two sections explicitly concerning gender and sexuality that involve not just stopping progress, but undoing decades of gains, stripping all of us of fundamental bodily autonomy, freedom of movement, freedom of dress, and obviously reproductive freedom. They say, quote, the next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, which is SOGI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency, regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. How many of us have received or hope to receive government grants to support our research? How many of us have benefited from SOGI data, finally, in major studies to acknowledge our actual existence and offer researchers a starting point in their assessment of LGBTQ discrimination? DEI work has transformed access to education, research agendas, knowledge production, and teaching in colleges and universities, expanding the range of people and ideas, challenging longstanding hierarchies, and pushing for greater equity and inclusion that was already long overdue. Our institutions, as we, I think, are learning right now, are not going to shield us from any of this. It is up to us to defend our dreams, our visions, our life's work, not only on our campuses, but perhaps even more urgently at the ballot box. Not sold? Let me read you one more paragraph that calls for our collective imprisonment. Pornography manifested today, this is a direct quote, in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding up disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protections. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynist exploiters of women. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce it and distribute it should be in prison. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders. And in case you didn't follow the beginning, this is anyone who talks, who's engaged in talking about transgender ideology, which I'm sure at this point is like every single person in this room. So that is it. Talking about transgender issues and needs is what makes you a pornographer. And this language is it's actually repeated in the interview by the superintendent of Oklahoma schools, who's at the head of this whole case around NEX, that we are pornographers for talking about people as being transgendered. So this is us, the Republican Party. In closing, this is my last paragraph. The Republican Party plans to outlaw our teaching and scholarship. They will classify us as registered sex offenders. They will have us imprisoned. Our colleges and universities will not protect us. Our professional associations will draft briefs that will be laughed at and torn up. a rapidly racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-trans political movement is actually shattering the foundation of 50 years of knowledge, policies, and ideas about bodily autonomy, reproductive justice, racial justice, and gender liberation, as well as the 20 years of substantial gains in transgender communities. While I enjoy sitting around with like-minded people discussing history, theory, the relationship between sex and gender as much as anyone, I'm obviously kind of freaking out. And I think we're going to lose everything if we don't re-engage with electoral politics and fight back against the right-wing machine with everything we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What great presentations. I think just a wonderful way of conjuring up Lynda's spirit and work. So we have a few minutes. Maybe I'll ask a question, and there are a few people in the audience who knew Lynda, so I want to leave maybe a few minutes for people to, recall their own memories of her and her extraordinary work. So just a couple of things that stood out to me. I love how you all just talked about her badassery. Carlos, Jimmy talked about her provocations and boldness, and Jen, her irreverence. And maybe a question I have is just about context, right? So courses where sexuality and queer show up on the stage first in 1993, and her course Sexuality on the Stage, and then in 94, or 95, Feminist Theory, Queering the Literary, with a kind of retrospective eye. When you're taking these courses in that moment, and with some distance now as people in the field, before these terms or even queer studies is codified and institutionalized in a different way, I wonder, with just as scholars in the field, how you think about that moment. And I can't help, especially Jen, after your presentation, I can't help but think about 93, 94. This is at the height of the AIDS crisis in this country. The death toll is at its peak. So she's teaching this material and introducing and hailing sexuality on the courses at a time of calamity, queer calamity, right? And you're making us think about this moment also and its political, its immediacy in terms of what we do in the academy and more broadly. So that moment and now in the field, however you want to take up maybe that question.
I don't, so I quote unquote specialized within the English major in sexuality studies, but that was and it was called lesbian and gay studies, I think, or it was starting to be called that at the time. And Lynda's was one of the very few courses that actually did that work. I did independent studies. I did a few things to make that happen. I have to say, I'm not sure it would be possible in the same way to teach sexuality on the stage at Rutgers the way that she taught it. And I don't know how you feel about your institutions, but I was part of the colleagues who we have a sexuality studies minor, and ever since the whole era of trigger warnings came in, that sort of shifted the terms under which some of this stuff was done. And I've taught research on sexualities, and there's all this preparation you have to do, and you always have to give students the option to do something other than what you want to show, if you want to show a porn film or whatever it is that you're going to do. And then you also, and that's much worse now. I'm talking 10 years ago, because I actually haven't taught a course I've taught at the graduate level, but not as much as the undergrad level. The kind of provocative content and material that Lynda exposed us to do that today would be way riskier than, to me, it feels way riskier And I'm sure it felt risky to her at the time, but I'm just curious about, I think that the ground has really shifted in a way that's made it almost perilous. Because then there's always that possibility that there's going to be the odd student who'll go complain, and then things will escalate, right? And then things about academic freedom kick in, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard.
Yeah, I would say one of the things about her was that she was incredibly daring, but she was also incredibly anxious about being incredibly daring. So I wrote a piece that came out, and a bunch of people did as part of this edition in Women in Performance, and I went back to it, and I remember a couple of things, and the one thing that struck me the most was that I wrote about the fact that I was walking her to class one day, and she said, "I'm nervous and I don't want to go in." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because one of the students in my class asked me if I was a lesbian." And I said, "What did you say?" And she said, "Don't be so presumptuous." So it wasn't safe for her to be out then. And so I think this is part of the issue that and I think Jen articulated it really well. Like, she believed in this work that had a kind of synergy that brought together all of these art with theory, with literature and politics, and she devoted herself to it, but she was still very, uncomfortable about what that meant. And Jen hit it on this point too. She was white, it's Southern, and she thought that she was being read all the time as white trash by the elite at Penn. So it was a class issue, and then it was on top of it her sexuality, and she still, pushed forward. And even when after I graduated, she was going up for, she was afraid about tenure, and then I forget, I don't remember the story, so I don't want to get it right, but get it wrong. But she eventually got tenured, but she was initially denied full at the department level. And then I was like, "But you're in conversation with Eve Sedgwick, like, you're doing this." And my father had a printing company. She had all these posters, and I was like, "Let's laminate them. Let's laminate. You're in conversation like with all these people." And so she said yes. And I said, we have like this lamination like portfolio, because she, was doing this work, but at the same time, and she was recognized as sort of an early architect of performance studies. But at the same time, she was in an incredibly tenuous position here. And then to your point about, reading the work with Stuart Curran and stuff, there's two things. One, and I mentioned it in the piece, she appreciated the traditional stuff. She was hungry for knowledge. She said that she read Tristram Shandy in a day. She read Richard III, and she would tell me when I became a teacher, because I did that before I got my PhD, she said, "You can't go in there telling them what Farah and I taught you. You have to go and tell them about all of those great white men, Jim. Tell them about Poe and Hawthorne and Melville." I remember one time she said to us in her office, she said, "You want to be subversive?" And I was like, "What does that mean?" I'm like, I didn't score that high on verbal on the SAT. Like, what? And she said, "You have to." So she would say, like, you had to we had to master the canon in order to do this work. She wasn't saying that you didn't need to do this. And she thought that a political way of getting at sexuality was to show them that you could do it. And Farah was the same way. I remember in class one day, she said, "I had to master Chaucer before I did Black literature." And it was a very, very different time. And I said, that's what's changed. I mean, so when I went to Columbia and they said, "You have to do 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century," I said, "But I want to do 19th and I want to do Black." They said, "No, I was already trained that I would have to know that canonical stuff." And so I think that's part of her piece too, is that she was very strategically negotiating those lines.
We're out of time, but can I make time? If anybody in the audience, if there is something that you want to share about Lynda, because I know a couple of you knew her. So we'll, encroach on the break. So just yes.
to make sure that either I or Gloria or somebody else goes into the classroom so that you know there's a resource in the learning center before and after, and I really appreciated and she said in a way that a lot of faculty never did. And she really stood out.
All right, well,
I would be remiss not to note that in Lynda's memory, GSWS has actually 2 teaching awards, right? It's the Lynda Hart Teaching Award, which recognizes teachers. Why am I struggling when I can put on my glasses? Who have cultivated a learning environment that facilitates, encourages, and engages feminist critique and who prioritize inclusive classroom practices. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you so much. What a rich discussion.